The next one is called capitalization, also known as the income approach. And as you might guess, it's used on income producing properties. And the best definition of what the income approach is this line here. It establishes the present worth of future benefits that may be derived from the property, the present worth of future benefits. Let's say I told you that I have a milk cow for sale, right? An old metaphor example. A milk cow for sale, and last year this cow produced $50,000 worth of milk. Is that a valuable cow? A valuable cow. It died this morning. Is that a valuable cow? No, it's not. It's not a valuable cow, right? And that, the point is you don't buy a cow for last year's milk, because you don't get last year's milk. You buy the cow for a future anticipated stream of milk. You don't buy an apartment building for last year's rent. You're not going to get last year's rent. You buy the apartment building for an anticipated future stream of income. That's called forecasting. And based, because we have to project in the future, is it going to go up, is it going to go down, or that sort of thing. Inwood and Hoskell are two clowns that have developed theories involving capitalization. Hoskell uses a sinking fund. That's pretty much all they want you to know. I'll explain that, what that means, at an appropriate place. So what is capitalization? It comes from the Latin word capita, which means head. So the top of a column is called the capital. If you were guilty of a capital offense, it at one point meant they would cut your head off, you know. I'm going to skip another metaphor. So the capita means head. So if let's say there's a lake, a reservoir, and this lake or the reservoir has a stream that flows from it, and you want the water that's coming from that stream. So you've decided to buy the reservoir, the lake, the headwaters, as it were, for this stream. Now, how much would you pay to own that lake or reservoir? Well, that would depend upon how big is the stream of water that comes out every day, every week, every month, every year, and how long is it likely to keep doing that. So if an investor is buying a 14-unit apartment building, what essentially they're doing is they're buying the headwaters, right? They're buying the lake from which the river of income, hopefully the stream of income, is going to flow in the future. One way to look at this, I have to remember to change these numbers, but I'll just go with it. One way to look at this, it's like having a machine that makes money. And let's say that you had a machine and you had to buy it you have to lease it from the government, you have to buy their paper and ink, you have to pay licensing fees, there's maintenance expenses, electricity is used, all of that sort of stuff. But every year, this little machine that you own nets $10,000. Every year it nets $10,000. That's not bad, right? I'd like to have 10 of them, but every day when I go to work, right? Every day you go to work, you come home, and there are these dollar bills sitting on the floor that the machine had spit out that day while you were working. Not too bad. So let's say you own this machine and it nets $10,000 a year. I'd like to buy it from you. Would you sell it to me for $10,000? Probably not, right? Because you could just, in a year, you would have that much money too. How about $50,000? Would you sell me a machine that makes $10,000 a year for $50,000? Now, I'm probably getting warmer with that offer. How about $100,000? Right now, I got it, 100 grand. It's all yours. Just sign over the machine that makes $10,000 a year. Let's say I had hit your number, right? Let's say. Now, that would mean I pay you $100,000 and the machine makes $10,000 a year net income. That means my machine, it's now mine because I bought it from you, my machine is getting a 10% return, right? The rate of return is 10%, right? Because it's $100,000 and it makes $10,000 a year, that's 10%. So the formula, and I want you to know if you're hating this already, right? If any of you are like hating this already, and if nobody's hating it yet, just give it a little time. But if you're hating this already, I just want you to know the Department of Real Estate is unlikely to have any arithmetic questions whatsoever on your state exam, right? They're not going to ask you to do math, but they want you to understand the formula. So the formula is the rate times the value equals the income. So if I'm getting a 10% rate of return and the machine is worth $100,000, then that means it's making $10,000 a year. Now, if the value were missing, because think of this like 2 times 3 equals 6. If the 3 were missing, intuitively would know if you took the 6 and you divided by the 2, you'd get the 3. If the value is missing, and if it's an appraisal question, value is what is missing, then you would take the income, $10,000, divide that by the rate, 10%, and that would tell you the value. This is IRV, income divided by rate equals value. That's the capitalization formula. We will talk more about that. By the way, if you don't hate this and you're thinking this is kind of interesting, talk to me about commercial real estate, right? Because oftentimes this particular class is where some people say, I never want to even have to think about that stuff again. And other people are realizing there's probably a lot of money that can be made if you know how to do this. And there is. So capitalization is the process of expressing anticipated future benefits in dollars and discounting them to a present worth. It converts in the ratio that formula converts income into value. So there's 2 things here. First of all, this anticipated future benefits and discounting them to a present worth. What this is known is a discussion about the future value of money. And present money is generally worth more than future money, right? And therefore is more valuable. And future money, current value, is discounted. Now, I bet you already understand this concept, but let me ask it in a different way. Now, let's say you win the lottery, right? You're buying one of those tickets at the 7-Eleven or whatever. You buy a ticket, you scratch it, you win $20 million. Ooh, right? You won $20 million. Now, what you're going to find is that they're going to give you 2 choices for the $20 million. One choice is you get $20 million, and you get it at $1 million a year for the next 20 years. The second choice might be 11 million today. Like right now, 11 million, but if you stick it out, you can get the whole thing. Most people take the 11 million today and not, I'll wait for 20 years to get all 20. Most people take, now, if you understand why people would do that, and if you're thinking, I'd do that too, I want as much money as I can get now so I can enjoy myself now, then you understand capitalization, right? Because what we're doing is we're taking this future income stream and we're discounting it down to a value today where give me this much and I'll give you that stream of income. So the formula, income divided by rate equals value, it converts income into value. The more income, the more value, the less income, the less value. You'd want to review all contract provisions. We're closing a leased premise transaction next week, signing off tomorrow and the next day. And one of the things was if you're buying a property and it has income, the appraiser would like to look at the leases, right, and review them and see if that matches the income. So capitalization determines the value of an asset by dividing the income by a desired rate. There are 3 steps. First step is you have to create a capitalization rate. Notice this is the most difficult step. Just wait till I get to it. You'll see what we mean. Then the annual net income is determined. That's actually probably one of the easier steps. And then the third step is, well, you take out a calculator. I guess that's the easier step. And you take the value, right? Now, I did income divided by rate equals value. On the state exam, we know they use this alliteration of it, value equals the income divided by the rate. So let's talk about this rate. The capitalization rate is the ratio between value and income. It's dependent upon the return which investors demand before they're attracted to an investment. We'll get to that. By analyzing market prices and interest rates, capitalization rates can be approximated. So we're analyzing market prices. So when we're doing capitalization rates and we want to know what other kinds of retail buildings have what kind of capitalization rates, what we would do is we would look at the sales price of those properties. In other words, we're using market data to determine what the cap rate is in an area by looking at sales prices of similar properties and then looking at their net income. And if we know their net income and we know what they actually sold for, we know what capitalization rate based upon the market that they got on that transaction. And if we're looking at enough of these, we get an idea. But sometimes we have to use the financial marketplace. So the capitalization rate, it could be the summation method. I'm giving you an example of that in a moment. The comparison is the most common method. That's what I just described. We have 5 other retail properties that sold in San Leandro. We know what they sold for. We know what their net income was because they had to tell you that when they put it on the market. We take out our calculator. We know the rate. Actually, the software already calculates that. That's the best method to use. I'll talk to summation in a moment. The greater the risk, the higher the rate. The quantity, quality, and durability of the rent are considered. Boy, 2 things there. The greater the risk, the higher the rate. I'm going to give you an example of that in a little bit. But let's talk about the quantity, quality, and durability. So the question is, when we are capitalizing an income property, what exactly does that mean? What are we capitalizing? And the answer is the lease. The answer is the lease. So the value of a commercial building, an income producing building, is oftentimes determined by the lease rather than anything else. Quantity means the amount of the rent. Quality means who's the tenant. And durability means the term of the lease. There are 2 buildings that you could own. One building, both commercial buildings. One building is sort of in a rundown area, kind of close to the airport, noisy, industrial kind of an area, homeless camps not too far away. Amazon has just signed a 10-year lease on the property. The other one is in a beautiful area of downtown. It's a relatively new building. It's modern, it's clean. It's been vacant for the last 3 years. So which building would you rather own? Would you rather own the beautiful looking building downtown that nobody has rented in years, or the ugly building that Amazon has just signed a long-term lease for? Most people would go with the Amazon building, right? Because what you're capitalizing, and using that formula, the income divided by the rate equals value, what you're capitalizing is really that lease. It's one of our escrows right now involves a retail property that is vacant, right? Which is normally not good because it means there is no lease. It's the development potential and its location that we were able to sell it anyhow. But you understand, if you're looking for income for the next 10 years, you're going to go with the quantity, quality, and durability. So let's say that Amazon's lease, by the way, instead of being 10 years, only was 3 years left. Would that make a difference? One of the emails that I was responding to today is how long is the lease on one of the taqueria. that's on one of the properties that we're selling. How many more years is remaining on that lease? We had a nice talk about that. Yeah, and so obviously the length of time that Amazon signed the lease would affect the value of that building. Because if they're only got 3 years left, in 3 years they might move to some other place, and now all you have is a dumpy building next to the airport. The capitalization approach estimates the value based on already sort of a repeat. Band of investment. So let's say I have a 1,500 unit apartment building. That's income property, and I want to appraise it. And I want to know what capitalization rate would be appropriate. Now, the most accurate and common way is to find other properties that have sold similar properties that have sold recently, and take a look at what they sold for and what their net income was, and figure out the rate based on that. How many 1,500 unit apartment buildings do you think sell in Silicon Valley every year? And the answer is virtually none do. There's no market data, right? You understand, we go through all the records. No one has sold anything that looks like that in 10, 15 years. There's no market data, right? So now, how do we know what rate of return we would want to use on that? And the answer is the answer is Neapolitan ice cream. That's you know Neapolitan ice cream, don't you? So Neapolitan ice cream, if you're familiar with it, and I'm sure you are, involves 3 flavors, right? Isn't that right? Right. Which one's in the middle? Well, anyhow, so my point about Neapolitan ice cream is, if you've ever had it, like in your freezer, and you got a family or whatever, have you ever noticed that some people, you open up the box of ice cream and somebody's like tunneled out one of the flavors, right? They've like mined their favorite and left the other, right? So that's has a application in real estate. So we're going to talk about 3 flavors of an investment. So the premise is we have a 1,500 unit apartment building. We have no idea what investors would expect on a property like this, because none of them have sold recently in our area. What would we do? We might start by talking to one of the big banks, right? We would find a big bank that lends money on 1,500 unit apartment buildings. They probably thought about this. So we asked the bank, if I were going to get a loan on a 1,500 unit apartment building, what is the maximum loan you'd be willing to give me? They say 50%, right? You don't get 80% loans in commercial. I'm just saying, rarely do you do that, right? And now then I would ask, well, what interest rate are you going to charge me? And the bank says 6% interest. So that gave me a flavor of the investment. And that flavor is based upon that 50%. What would a lender who studied the issue expect to get? They get 6%. So the whole property isn't getting 6%. 50% of it is producing 6%, or that flavor, that band's overall contribution is 3, 50% of 6. Now, we still need another 50%. So we find other investors, other lenders that are willing to make seconds on this kind of a property. And so that investor, that lender says, I'll lend you 25% as a second, but I want 8% interest. We have more information now. That second flavor, the 25% that the second lender wants at 8%. So the whole property isn't producing 8%, 25% is producing 8%, and that's 2%, right? Which is 1/4 of 8. So then there's my equity, right? Now there's the 25% I have to put down, or any buyer would have to put down. Now, who has the most to lose in this situation? Well, some people say, well, the first, because the first has got 50%. Yeah, but the first gets paid first. That's why they're called the first. The second gets paid second. The last to get paid is the owner. So if they're getting 8% and 6%, I want more than that because I got more risk. Statement that we went over, the higher the risk, the higher the rate. I want 10%. 25% is producing 10%, overall 2.5%. And if you added those all together, you'd get 7.5%. Now, let me just repeat that the Department of Real Estate is unlikely to ask you any math questions. let alone this one. And by the way, the last time they did ask a math question about the band of investment theory, the answer is 7.5%. I'm just saying. But what they want you to know about the band of investment theory is that it looks at what lenders and other investors are expecting to get in terms of rate of return on similar investments, to use that as a way of coming up with the capitalization rate. So remember, we said there was band of investment. I just did that. The comparison, I've mentioned that several times. We look at other properties that sold and their net income, their sales price, we figure out the rate of return. Now we have the summation method, right? The summation method. And the way that works is, let's say we have a building, and the purple, by the way, think of that as a field of lavender, in that that's supposed to represent ground, earth, but I've changed it's a long story. So anyhow, we have a building, the building is sitting on a lot. Now the building has a limited economic life. And an economic life of a building is the time period over which the building becomes not worth its upkeep. But then the building also has a physical life, and the physical life is longer than the economic life, right? There's a saying in real estate that more buildings are torn down than fall down. We rarely wait for a building to reach the end of its physical life and just collapse into the dirt. Once it reaches the end of its economic life, we tear it down. So I was doing this class in Santa Barbara, and a lady in the class, a woman in the class, started giggling, right, as I was finishing up this little thing here. And having done this class before, let's just say, typically without any giggles, I inquired what she found about, this so amusing. And she said it reminded her of her ex-husband. That's what she said. Because she said that he had reached the point where he was not worth his upkeep. That was her evaluation, but he was still there, right? You understand? So his physical life apparently was longer than his economic life. Well, that aside, if I'm an appraiser and I'm appraising this building, what I'm really interested in is how much is remaining economic life. So one way to think of capitalization and this summation method, it's like buying a racehorse. It's like buying a racehorse. So you ask the guy selling the racehorse, well, how long do horses like this run and are able to win races? And he says 5 years, right? That's how long a horse like this can run and win races. Great. Now that 5 years, that was the economic life, right? Essentially, of the horse. So I say, great, how long have you been racing this one? And he says, oh, about 4.5. Well, that's not so good, right? You understand, at the end of the 5 years, it doesn't mean that the horse is dead. The horse is, fine, in fact, happier. It's not having to run around the track anymore, right? But it isn't winning anymore. So we don't really want to know as much about the total economic life. We want to know how much is remaining. Let's say there's 20 years of remaining economic life. Now, what that means is we need to get 5% a year to get a return of our investment. So when we invested in this building and it has 20 years of remaining life, if we got 5% a year for 20 years, we would get 100% of our money back. That would be a return of our investment. And what it's doing is looking at the future depreciation of the property and including a part of the rate to compensate for that. Now remember that Inwood and Hoskell guys, those clowns, and one of them had the sinking fund. And what the sinking fund was is that they would basically put money into this fund over that time rather than it being in the rate. That's more than you need to know about it. So if I got 5% a year for 20 years, I'd get a return of my money back and I would break even. But I'm not doing this to break even, right? There's no reason to bother. I'm already even. So in addition, I want to get a 10% return on my money. How do I come up with that? I look at what other people are getting. If they're getting 10%, I want 10%. If they're getting 12, I want 12. If they're only getting 8, I'll take 8, right? I'll take what other people are getting. The market determines that. We add those two together, sum them, we have a 15% cap rate. That's called the summation method. So, are you having fun yet? If you are, talk to me about commercial real estate. There's a question on the state exam about a hardware store in the post office. And I know you can't take what's going on like now and interpret Department of Real Estate questions, because they write their questions oftentimes years ago. And so they're not really, you know, I'm just saying, I don't want to hear about post office. I don't want to hear about it. So we have a post office. So this is the scenario. Your rich uncle died and left you $5 million. And you've decided you're never going to work again. So what you're going to do is you're going to buy a retail building, and you're going to, that's already leased to somebody, so that you pay cash for the building, you get the income every month, you never have to work again, right? All you do is you walk out every month to your mailbox and your house coat and bunny slippers to get the check, right? That's all you need to do, or automatic deposits. So you find two buildings that you could buy, right, for $5 million. These two buildings were built at the same time by the same builder. They're right next to each other. They're the same rough layout and design, the same square foot. They've been maintained the same. Both buildings have just signed 20-year leases. The same company drew up the leases. The leases are carbon copies of each other. They're paying exactly the same amount of rent. The only difference between these two properties is who the tenant is. One of them, the tenant, is the United States Postal Service, and the other one is an independent hardware store. Now, you don't want to have to work again. Which building would you rather own? And the correct answer for the state exam is the post office. And the reason is because we're going to run out of money before the government does. That may be true, right? You understand, we'll run out of money before they do. So if the government has signed a long-term lease, you know, we're assuming that it's going to be there for 20 years and paying the rent. Now, the hardware store guy has never missed a rent payment, always been on time, but they're putting in a new Lowe's in the area, and Walmart is talking about a superstore. They could be on the ropes. So what would happen? Obviously, you would probably go with the post office because it's a better, the quality of the tenant, right? The certainty of being paying. So what the guy that has the hardware store tenant says, look, I know my tenant is not as good as next door at the post office. I get that. But I'll do this. I'll sell you that building, the one that has the hardware store tenant, for $4,500,000. So you're getting the same building, you're getting the same rent, you're getting the same lease, but for that risk, right? Because we're not the government. For that risk, we're willing to knock off $500,000, buy yourself a couple of Teslas, go on a vacation with the money. Now, what they've done by lowering the price when the income remains the same, right? The income remains the same and the value goes down. For those of you mathematically minded, you can play with that income divided by rate equals value formula. But what's going to happen is that if the value goes down, but the income is the same, the rate of return goes up, right? So they're offering you a higher rate of return, but it has a higher risk. Therefore, it has a higher rate. When interest rates go up, capitalization rates go up. Why? Because they pay attention to lenders, right? Remember band of investment? They're asking, well, what would a bank get? What would Chase get? What would an investor get, right? As the capitalization rate increases, the value of the property decreases, assuming that income remains the same. If the rate goes up, what that means is investors are demanding a higher rate of return, but the property isn't making any more income. So the only way they can get a higher rate of return is if the value goes down. If net income is constant, but interest rates increase, the value will go down. Why? because when interest rates increase, capitalization rates increase. And if capitalization rates increase, but the income is constant, then the value goes down. The capitalization rate is a return on, remember, return on and a return of the investment, and the return of the investment is depreciation, and selecting the cap rate is the most difficult part. Doesn't it seem like a difficult part? So income divided by rate equals value. Rate is difficult. Income may be a little bit simpler. Now we're going to look at it two different ways. This is what is sometimes referred to as the annual income ladder, where you take scheduled gross income, subtract vacancies, adjusted gross, subtract expenses, you get net income, net operating income. From that, you would subtract loans, cash flow, income tax to get something called net spendable. Now, the way this flows is useful for answering questions on the state exam. Notice this TIMR thing, where that's taxes, insurance, management, maintenance, utilities, replacement reserves, which are what the expenses are. But I like to explain it a different way. And so I'm going to, right? Because it's hard to stop me at this point. And I call this the 3 sets of books. If you had an apartment building, how many sets of books would you keep? I've had people say 2, one for me, one for the IRS, right? I've had people say 2, one for me, one for my partner. You know, isn't that nice? So we're going to talk about 3 sets of books you might keep if you had an apartment building. The first set of books is called operating income, and operating income is what the appraiser is looking at. And when we're appraising property, is the appraiser interested in past income, present income, or future income? Which is it that the appraiser is interested in? And I could hear you all shouting, future income. Very good, very good. So we're interested in future income. So we would start with the annual gross at 100%. That's sometimes called scheduled gross, at 100% occupancy. Now, that's really the dollars that we could get. That's assuming every apartment was rented and everyone paid the rent on time. But we know that's not going to happen. So from that, we're going to subtract vacancies and uncollected rents. Those are the dollars we won't get. And if you took the dollars you could get and then subtracted the dollars you won't get, what you end up with is the dollars you will get. And that's called effective gross. And from that, we're going to subtract expenses, and we're going to subtract fixed expenses, and fixed expenses are expenses that do not vary really, but they're fixed. Doesn't seem logical. Examples are property taxes and insurance premiums. Supposing I have this apartment building and it's half empty. Would it be effective for me to call the property tax assessor up and say, hey guys, I want you to reassess me at a lower rate because my apartment building is half empty? They're not going to do that, right? You understand? They don't care that your apartment building is full or half full. They don't care. The property tax is fixed. How about your insurance premiums? Call up the insurance company and say, hey, my apartment building is half empty. Why don't you cut my rates? That's not going to work. First of all, not only aren't they going to cut your rates, if you tell them you have that many vacancies, they might cancel you or raise your rates because there's more arson in vacant units. But for all intents and purposes, property taxes and insurance are fixed expenses. They don't vary. Then you have variable expenses, and variable expenses vary, like advertising and maintenance and utilities and things like that. And then you have reserves for replacement. And reserves for replacement is money that we've set aside, because the other 2 is actually money we've paid out. But this is just money that we've set aside to replace the air conditioning system when it hits the end of its economic life, the heating system, the roof, other things like that. And once we've deducted those, what we end up with is net operating income. And that is the income that we divide by the rate in order to determine the value. Supposing my apartment building is in San Jose, but I live in Los Angeles. So I come up every month and I talk to the manager, talk to some of the tenants, look at the books, that sort of thing, you know, an inspection tour. That cost of traveling from LA to San Jose every month, would that be a deduction? Yeah. So if that's a deduction, then let's say I lived in New York City and I came every month to look at my apartment building, I guess I'd deduct the cost of that too. Let's say that I lived in Rio de Janeiro and I flew first class every month to come and look at my 5-unit apartment building in the central to east side of San Jose. Now, when I deduct the first class plane tickets from Brazil, how much net income is my 5-unit apartment building likely to show? And the answer is nothing, right? Because that wiped out the trip every month from Brazil. Would an appraiser say that an apartment building in San Jose has no value because the current owner happens to live in Brazil? Is that something an appraiser would say? Is living in Brazil a necessary thing to own this apartment building? Is it possible that the next owner might like live in San Jose and therefore not have to travel? So the appraiser would not include travel expenses, personal expenses. How about my loan? I have a loan on my apartment building. Would I deduct that? If you're saying yes, of course you would. So I should have pointed out that my loan is not a very good loan. It came from like organized crime, you know, I think. It's like 40% a year. It's terrible, terrible. Is the value of an apartment building dependent upon the current owner's financing? Is it possible that the next owner might pay cash or have a different loan? So we wouldn't include that either. Now, if you're saying, wait a second, I know you can deduct travel expenses and interest on a loan. I know you can deduct that. You're probably talking about taxable income. And when you're looking at taxable income, you're not looking at future income, you're looking at past income, right? When you pay your taxes, you're not paying it for next year, you're paying it for last year. So this, for some people, is an epiphany. We're not talking about the same money, right? The appraiser is looking at an anticipated future income stream from an apartment building, whereas the IRS is looking at, what did you do last year? So we would start essentially with what is net operating income, but we could deduct interest on a loan, and we could deduct reasonable personal expenses. That's the IRS definition of reasonable. We might have trouble with the Brazil trips, but you know, we'll see. And the third thing we get is a depreciation deduction, which I cover in the income class, which is a tax deduction that lowers your taxable income. And then what we have left over is taxable income, and that's where you pay your taxes. The third type of income is really looking at present income. Present income. So let's say I want to know if I'm going to have enough money at the end of the year to buy a new Tesla. Right? That's my goal, right? And I'm going to start with my net income. I'll deduct vacancies and I'll deduct fixed expenses and variable expenses and all that sort of stuff. But I'm now going to deduct all my personal expenses. If I'm really traveling to Brazil every month, I've got to put that in because it's eating into the Tesla budget. I'll deduct principal, I'll deduct interest, and what I end up with is called cash flow. And it's out of your cash flow that you pay your taxes. And what you have after you pay your taxes, that's called net spendable. So no deductions for PIPE. See the memory there? No deductions for principal, interest, and personal expenses. That's from operating income. Now you have to be careful when you're on the state exam, because when they ask you questions about income and what can you deduct, you have to be very clear. Are they talking about appraisal income? Are they talking about IRS income? Because they're not the same. I also not a deduction, adding a clubhouse, income tax, depreciation, those are not deductions. So capital expenditures and loan expenses are not considered in establishing the net income. The largest expense is property taxes. That's so true. Management is most often overlooked. Well, how about this? I manage it myself. Do I have a management expense? The answer is yes. Because I might be able to get a job and do something with my time. My time is worth something, right? If I had to hire somebody, what would I have to pay them? That's really the management expense. Fixed expenses are taxes and insurance. I already covered that. Economic versus contract rent. Contract rent is based on the leases, but economic rent is the rent it will reasonably produce, which is established by comparison of rents. So one of the issues involving one of our transactions in the lease is that the lease has several years left to run, and the lease is below market as to its rate, right? Below market as to its rate. So when you're valuing the building, are you valuing it based upon the current income, or are you looking to see, well, they'll be gone in a few years and we can kick them out? The property's gross income should be based on economic rent. What could you rent it for? And you should verify that people are actually paying that amount in rent. Ground rent is the portion that goes to the land. That's just a definition. If an expense increases, the value decreases more, and that's because of that ratio thing. I'm not going to do math. I don't do math anymore. A reconstructed operating statement is what you would get with just an estimate of income and expenses, and vacancy level and rental income fluctuate. Boy, have they fluctuated recently. Then there's something called the gross rent multiplier. And the issue with capitalization, and capitalization is more accurate than a gross rent multiplier, is that capitalization requires that you know net income. So remember, I've given examples like, how do we come up with the capitalization rate? And the answer is we look at properties that have sold recently and we try to determine what their net income was. Now, sometimes it's easy because in the system we use, they told us, but sometimes they don't. So then we would have to, and we do this, call and ask people if they would please tell us their net income. Can you imagine that not everybody wants to do that? If I called you up and I said, hey, I know you sold your apartment building 3 months ago and I see the price, 2.8 million, very nice, very nice. By the way, if you don't mind, could you tell me how much were you netting every year? How much? Just give me a hint. They may not be willing to share that information with me, right? You might not be willing to do that either. So we can't always know net, but it's a lot easier to know gross. So we know if it's an apartment building, we know what they were renting them for. We know what a reasonable vacancy factor is. We can guess fairly accurately how much they're grossing. We know what they sold it for, because that's recorded at the county recorder's office. We figured out what they're grossing, we divide, and we get something called a gross rent multiplier. And the gross rent multiplier is a multiplier that you multiply times the gross rent to get the value. And the way you come up with the multiplier is by looking at properties that sold and what their gross rent was. And you figure out what the multiplier is. By the way, I've got a client looking for a duplex again, but the last duplex I sold in Cupertino, at that time, Cupertino had a rent multiplier, an annual rent multiplier of about 20. And this property produced $100,000 in gross income, not bad for a little duplex, in gross income, and it sold for a little over $2 million, which is roughly a multiplier of 20. So the gross multiplier, it provides a rough estimate of value by multiplying a monthly multiplier or an annual one by a commonly accepted number. That's the multiplier. We don't have to go look at the property. You don't have to determine net income. And they have a math example. And most of the time, under 20, even in our market, in San Francisco, it was 30 for a while. was the multiplier, but usually multiplier, certainly under 50, would be an annual one, and it would be several times that if it were going to be monthly, like 12 times that. Cost approach. So remember there were 3 approaches, right? You remember that.